Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are. Welcome. My name is Johannes Linn, and I serve as the co-chair of the Scaling Community of Practice. Larry Cooley and I welcome you to this third plenary session of the Community of Practice's annual workshop. It's the last session in the workshop overall, and Larry and I are delighted to have you all join us today. By the way, Larry is, of course, my alter ego and the co-chair, the other co-chair of the community practice, and he and I will be managing this session together. Many of you, of course, have been in some of our earlier sessions, and so I will keep the introduction short. Just to remind you all that the community practice is voluntary and it's free of charge, but it does depend on everybody's participation and input to make sure we get the most out of it, all of us. The community practice is dedicated to advancing and professionalizing the practice of scaling by learning across sectors, geographies, and different perspectives. And of course, you can learn a lot more about us and the community on our website, www.scalingcommunityofpractice.com, which you'll also find in the chat. As in the other sessions, the earlier sessions, a few housekeeping remarks. The session is being recorded, and a few days after the event, we will circulate a video recording along with the PowerPoint slides and a summary of the event to all of those who have registered, and of course to all of you who are participating in the session. We will also put the slides, the video, and the summary eventually on the community's website. Now, comments and questions. Please do share any comments and questions you might have with us. Put them in the chat box at the top of your screen. You can enter, and indeed you're welcome to enter your comments at any time during the session, and we'll try to respond as best as we can. During the discussion segments, if you want to intervene personally with your camera and your microphone, go to reactions on your screen, and you'll find instructions there how to let us know. If you're not speaking, please make sure your microphone is muted and your camera is turned off. That will help with bandwidth and also make sure any interference is kept to a minimum. So thank you very much. Let's then turn to today's session. We have two halves, divided in two halves, the session. The first half is to look back over the 10 prior sessions and explore what have been the major takeaways and major lessons, perhaps even, that we can summarize from these prior sessions. And we have a great speaker to start off that conversation, Nwuneli, who will join us in a minute, and I will introduce her in a minute as we get started on the first half. Now, her contribution will then be followed by discussion with your comments, questions, and feedback. The second half of the session is going to be Larry and I presenting and discussing the new strategy of the community practice for 2023 to 2025. And we'll very much appreciate your input as we chart the way forward for the community. And indeed, we will need your input so that also your participation in future is what it needs to be. With that as an overview, let's then turn to the first half. And what we, as I said earlier, what we want to do here is to look back at our earlier sessions of the annual workshop. And I have to say, as I personally look back, it was just a tremendous series of each individual event being outstanding and incredibly informative for me personally anyway. We had a total of about 1,900 registrations for the event, and of the 1,900, about 900 actual participants in the 10 sessions. We had amazing speakers, many from the Global South, all of them sharing their experience and perspectives. We had great audience engagement in the chat box and occasionally live. So we're very grateful, Larry and I are extremely grateful to all of who made this possible, especially the working group chairs, the speakers, the participants, and of course the technical team that helped us in the background with their tireless efforts. That was Gabi, Natalie, Adam, and Sam, and we thank them very, very much. So now let's turn to share some takeaways from the 10 prior sessions. And as I mentioned, Ndidi Nwuneli will kick us off based on her participation and the summaries we have shared with her. Let me introduce Ndidi. I first met Ndidi about 8 years ago when she was at Harvard, and she was working on her first book, which was called Social Innovation in Africa, a Practical Guide for Social Impact. So when we talked about her work, I was incredibly impressed with her interest in scaling. And I was very happy to see that she had an interest in joining us actually in the community of practice in its early stages, and she has accompanied us throughout the years since then. By the way, she also published a second book in 2021 entitled Food Entrepreneurs in Africa, Scaling Resilient Agriculture Business. So it's clear that she has an abiding and lasting interest in scaling. But she's not principally a researcher. She's also very much an entrepreneur. She's a doer and a promoter. And let me briefly tell you a bit about what she's been up to. You will have seen it perhaps already in the bio that we flashed up earlier, but let me just summarize. So Ndidi is an expert on agriculture and nutrition, entrepreneurship and social innovation, as well as youth development. She has over 25 years of international development experience. She is the founder of LEAP Africa, L-E-A-P Africa, the founder also of Changing Narratives Africa and of African Food Change Makers. She's also the co-founder of Sahel Consulting Agriculture Nutrition Limited and of AACE Foods Processing and Distribution Limited. She also sits on a number of important boards for NGOs and foundations, and has been associated with young global leaders of the World Economic Forum, the Bridge Span Group, and African Philanthropy Forum. So Ndidi is clearly extremely well qualified to share with us her views on what were her takeaways from the earlier sessions. As she speaks, please feel free to add your comments and questions in the chat regarding her observations, but also your takeaways from the annual workshop overall, and any feedback that you might have on what worked and what didn't work, so that next time round, when we organize the next workshop, we can do even better than we've done this time. After Ndidi's opening comments, Larry will moderate the discussion. So Ndidi, over to you. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. It's really an honor and privilege to be here. I hope you can all hear me. Thank you, Johannes, for that excellent introduction.
Yes,
and I want to thank you. And I want to specifically thank you and Larry for your pioneering work in this sector. Both of you have been amazing. And when I was working on my book on scaling social innovation, you were an angel in my time of need, finding someone who shared my passion and who had a wealth of experience. And you were so generous with your ideas and your feedback on the book. So I'm eternally grateful to you and obviously to this entire community for the support over the years. I have a brief presentation, which I'm sure will be coming up shortly, but it has been a fascinating 10 sessions, and reviewing the notes, I was so impressed with not only the group that you had put together, but also the insights that they had shared and the diversity of ideas and thoughts. So I obviously will not do justice to all of this, but I'll try my best to do justice to all the great insights that were generated, and a wonderful applause to the entire team behind the curation of this, because every session was spot on. So the first key takeaway is really the role of funders and scaling. And from every single session, this came up. The role that funders play through their actions or inactions, through the incentives or disincentives that they provide for scaling. And the critical issues that were surfaced were really, first, the lack of common knowledge. What does scaling mean to different sectors, to different funders? And we saw the diversity of thoughts. Are people scaling programs? Are they scaling ideas? Are they scaling policies? are they scaling interventions? And do funders recognize how critical building and scaling into the DNA of an intervention is from the onset? There was also a discussion about the focus on innovation versus scaling, with a lot of bias for funding innovation as opposed to trusted, proven, less sexy models that actually work. And how do we switch out that bias or balance it as we work in this sector on very difficult problems? A third issue is really the available financing instruments. Do we have the right instruments? And do funders prefer pilots and short-term focused projects with quick wins as opposed to medium to long-term projects? Because scaling takes time. Scaling is difficult. And we know that oftentimes the challenge is around getting funding to scale, as opposed to getting funding to test. And I love this quote from one of the presenters, which says, if you go for low-hanging fruit, you get mostly watermelons. Watermelons are squishy and full of water, but very, very little substance. And if we really want to scale, we have to fund the difficult problems, get into the trenches, and be there for the long term. Another point was around conditionalities and processes, which are not suited for scaling. How many program officers? What are the steps required? How difficult is the reporting requirement? And do these conditionalities also position more international organizations to get funding for scaling versus local organizations? And I wanted to underscore that divide because that's a current hot topic in my ecosystem around how local organizations really struggle because of the conditionalities and the processes that are put forward by funders. And then finally, the limited funding support for human resources, for the M&E, for the storytelling, for the policy work, as opposed to just the programmatic support. And that backbone infrastructure is so critical for scaling, especially scaling in many of our emerging economies. So these were critical issues that were raised by almost every session. And I think we need to think through how we engage funders to shift their mindsets around scaling. The second key takeaway really was the diversity in issues that we're facing by sector. And this is really interesting for me because I work in many of these sectors. Clearly, I work in food systems, but food systems are so linked to climate. Education and youth entrepreneurship and employment are heart of what I do, and less so health. But I was so struck by the key challenges with scaling in each of these sectors. And I just want to surface a few of them that came through. And let's start with education, because really education is the fundamental foundation. Quality as you scale and managing quality remains a challenge. And we saw this through the different models that were shared by World Vision and Curious Learning. The issue of around equity and those who are difficult to serve, those who are underserved, but also Black and Brown communities, obviously in the Western world, but in our context, equity around gender, equity around marginalized communities, regional communities, and fragile states. The new models that leverage technology and how technology enables scaling in education. And obviously, I talk in the issue of mental health, because I don't think we can talk about education today and scaling without the issue of mental health, because it's really crippling not just our primary and secondary institutions, but our universities with the challenges young people are facing and the complexity of the issues they're dealing with. Now, in the health landscape, clearly some very important issues around, do we focus on treatment and prevention versus mitigation? And where do we put our emphasis when it comes to scaling? And can we do all three at the same time? The focus on community versus facility-based interventions. And this is really, really interesting, because how do you involve the community in scaling in health? Because without community-based approaches, there are limits to how far we can go. And we see this very clearly in many emerging economies. The issue around product-based versus commercially and market-centered versus public sector-driven interventions. Healthcare is regulated in many of our countries by the public sector, but is there demand, and can we generate demand for the interventions for them to scale? To ensure that there is some partnership between the communities, the individuals who need the services and the public sector, and the shift from a supply-driven versus a demand-driven approach. And then how do we reach the largest populations in need versus those who need it the most? And what is rewarded? This was a very interesting question for me. The whole concept of we need numbers with scale, but then how do we ensure that we don't neglect those who need the services the most? And oftentimes we pick those who are easiest to serve versus those who are more difficult to serve. And then this whole concept of information science learning frames, and how do we measure impact, and how do we glean knowledge from the communities that are benefiting. For the food systems, it was very exciting to see the work in Rwanda, Kenya, and obviously the CGIAR movement. But everyone agreed that a systems approach is only what works now in food systems. We can't think about food in silos. We can't think of agriculture and financing in silos or nutrition in silos. It has to be a food system approach. The complexity of the partnerships and the interests that are all working either in alignment or against each other, and how you bring everyone around a shared vision. And then the role of policy and implementation, and whether government creates an enabling environment or actually frustrates the impact and the progress of change. And then in the climate, I mean, the magnitude of the financing required. And I love the groups that you pulled together for this session, because we saw a large donor, the Bezos Foundation, and then we saw implementers, and then the Green Climate Fund. So how do you bring in financing, given that even with the large funders, it's just a minuscule amount that they can bring to the table? How do we unlock public financing? How do we unlock private financing? And what's the power and the promise of partnerships, as well as the challenges between countries and the disparities in needs? And how can we leverage technology? We believe we have the technology to mitigate and adapt, but why isn't it being scaled? Who owns this technology and who pays for the services? And so these were all critical issues that were raised, and very timely, very important, and very pertinent for all of the sectors we work in, but all the stakeholders that were involved. And then youth entrepreneurship and employment. I've been working in this sector for years, and this cost per participant, how much does it cost to scale? And how can we reduce the cost to scale so we can serve more young people? And how can we deliver impact at scale, given how mobile young people are and the needs they have, and the changing dynamics of what entrepreneurship is today versus what it was yesterday? So these were so many insights and great insights that were generated by the speakers. And I applaud all of you who are speakers, who are presenters, and who asked those tough questions. Now, what are some of the key success factors that we gleaned from these last 10 sessions about scaling? And none of this is new to you, but I just want to reemphasize them. The first is that we have to have shared goals and clear definitions for what success or impact at scale looks like. Because if we don't define it, it means different things to different people, and we'll never achieve that impact and success. And I think it really varies by sector and varies by agenda, but it has to be defined from the onset. The second is that we need patient, long-term focused, appropriate financing instruments for scaling. And we've talked about this with funders. We need funders to understand what is required and change their own approach to enable more scaling. We need an enabling environment, enabling policy environment where government is a proponent for scaling and government comes in as a partner. And I love this quote from one of the speakers, which said, policy is the starting, not the finish line. Clearly, policy itself is not an end, but we need the enabling policy to really kickstart and scale. Another quote that I really enjoyed from the summaries was, government ownership has to be clear from the beginning, not after the intervention has been developed and tested. Political will is critical, but it's not just about politics. It's also about technical support and political support and enthusiasm for change. And sticking with the right administration is not enough, because you need the administration and technical support when the leader changes. And then this point around citizenship supports, because citizenship support and citizen support ensures that there's pressure on the government to do the right thing all the time and to continue with the scale even when administrations have changed. Number 4 is the importance of cross-sector partnerships with shared goals. And I love the Project Last Mile example. I think that was really powerful. Partnerships are important for scaling. And what measures are available to develop these partnerships? How can we support intermediaries in the spectrum and ensure that we engage them? And we've seen models where intermediaries are so important to the scaling, especially where you have large organizations, large international donors, and small local organizations. What is the role intermediaries can play? And then the whole number five is really leveraging ICT. We have big data, we have AI. This can help with implementation, M&E, and learning. And we can leapfrog in so many ways we couldn't 20 years ago. How are we leveraging technology? How are we reducing the cost of serving and scaling, leveraging technology? Number 5 was clear targets around impact. with transparent, measurable value addition, where we measure whether we're succeeding or failing and where we tell ourselves the honest truths about where we're going. And number 6 was really a focus on equity. How do you design for equity throughout the process? How do you ensure no one is being left behind? And this is hard. This is very, very hard in all of our ecosystems, but it's really, really critical. So these were the success factors I identified, and I'm sure you will identify many more as we progress. Now, as we look forward, there are 3 key messages I want to leave us with. I think the research on scaling is phenomenal. And again, Larry and Johannes have done a phenomenal job with laying the foundation and pushing us when we think about research on scaling. How are we learning? How are we sharing? How are we unlearning? And how can we broaden our community? Because this community has grown so rapidly, but who is not here? Who needs to be here? And I've pushed for more funders to be here, right? More policymakers to be here, more local organizations to be here. And as we broaden this community, how do we continue to unlearn what we've learned and the bad habits that have prevented us from scaling? The second piece of work I really think we have to think about is people-centered scaling. Which people? Who is really important to the scaling agenda? Because I've been at this for 25 years, and I can tell you the wicked problems are not being solved. And I'm often frustrated. Why aren't we solving them at scale? Why do we still have pilots? Why do we still have small projects that are being celebrated and are winning awards? Why can't we solve these problems at scale? And I live in Lagos. It's one of the largest cities in Africa. And you see it every day, the challenges, and they're growing. So why aren't we scaling? And I bring back this point about the largest populations in need versus those who need it the most. Who is designing for who? Who has agency? And how can we amplify the voices of local organizations? And number 3, implementation for sustainable impact. What are the levers for change? Who are the champions for change, especially in the funding community? And how can we galvanize them? How can we hold them accountable? How can we put some fire under their feet so that we can see the rapid transformation required to really get us to where we're going? So these are the questions I would like to leave us with. And I'm going to end with 2 quotes. One is actually my daughter's current mantra. She's a climate activist and she's 15. And she says, we're the first generation to fully bear the brunt of climate change and the last generation that can truly do anything about it. And I feel this way, not just about climate. I feel this way about health. I feel this way about education, about food security, is that we are all in legacy mode. I know Johannes and Larry are in legacy mode. It's really about what are we leaving behind for the next generation? Because our generation has faced the brunt of these problems, but we need to make sure that we don't continue to say the same thing 10 years from now, that we have tangible evidence, that we have scaled some of the best practices, some of the great innovations, and some of the wonderful interventions that many of us have created. And then my own current mantra. There's an African proverb that says, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And I think we can't afford to go far, or we need to go fast and far together. We need both. And to do this, we have to leave our egos and logos at the door. We have to work with humility, integrity, and excellence, incorporating scaling into the DNA of our interventions. So let's go fast and far together. Thank you again, and congratulations for this pioneering work. I'm so proud to be part of this community, and I look forward to working with you all.
Everybody join me in a virtual round of applause for that. What an extraordinary job, Ndidi. Thanks so much, not only for your kind words, but for so much insight in such a short amount of time. I want to open it up to all the rest of you for any questions or comments you might have. Here's what we're looking for. We're looking for anything important that you think you took away from this, any observations, any insights, any nagging questions that you want us to look at as a community, anything you think really is not getting the attention that it warrants. You can do that either by putting something into the chat box if you're so inclined, but we're also happy to have people come on camera and voice their suggestions. If you want to do that, just please raise your hand and I'll call on you. Hang on, let me see who that is. That looks like it's Laura Giron. Go ahead, Laura. Laura, can you come off mute? Gabby or Natalie, can you help Laura come off mute?
Okay, there I am. Thanks, everyone. Yes, Ndidi, that was an incredible bookend to an incredible couple of weeks, and I really want to thank you for taking that bird's eye view on the couple of weeks of rich discussions. I completely agree with you on everything that you said. And for me, this really reinforces that the annual workshop is a tremendous value, a tremendous contribution to the global community. For those of us who are passionate about scaling, we need to keep talking to one another, but we also need to reach out more widely to those who aren't talking about scaling. And that's also persuasive. That's why we got into this and expanded so long ago, and that there's still very much a lot of work needed to do in terms of getting implementers to become aware of and have the capacity to apply the science of scale up, like many people who presented this week. And so we have to figure out together how to facilitate that process. And so thank you all so much for a really rich couple of weeks. Back to you, Larry.
Thank you. Leonard?
Yeah, thanks. And great that Ndidi did this. It was really fantastic. Thank you, Ndidi. Well, I've not seen all of the workshops, but I think what I really see which is very nice, is that we've talked a lot about how to get from piloting to scaling. I think that has been really a strong focus for many years, but there's a lot of more attention now. Okay, so well, how do you get from scaling to impact, right? And that's a whole different ball game. And I think one of the important things that also Ndidi mentioned is like unlearning the way that we have been working up to now. And maybe a question to Ndidi, I don't know, in your work I see you as a huge advocate for this kind of work. What do you see are the arguments that are sticking with the people you talk to that make them really change their mind about, okay, it's not just about more of something, it's really about, are we making the change, or are we not doing more damage than good, right? Thanks for that.
Did you want to come back on screen and respond?
Thank you for your very kind words, Leonard and everyone else. I would say there are two things. One is persuasive data from these communities. I've started showing data of mistakes. And I'll give you an example. This is my current mantra with in the food ecosystem. Given the food crisis, we're seeing a lot more funders coming in with free food into many of our regions, and showing them the evidence that dumping food, free food, actually sets us back, actually destroys many of our projects. And how do I do that? I use the example of the stockfish. I don't know how many of you have heard of stockfish, but I'm Igbo, and during the Biafran War, Norwegian governments dropped stockfish from the plane. It's salted fish. It's over a year old, dried. And today, the Igbos import billions of dollars worth of stockfish from Norway. While that was a good intention, it was destructive, right, in the long term for the local fish industry. We're seeing the same thing now with people coming in with fertilizer and seeds as donations, or the World Food Program bringing in relief and showing the data, hard data evidence to say, guys, that's not how we do development. This will destroy all our market interventions around agriculture and food for the last 15 years that are scaling. With one intervention, you can set us back. We have 80 local seed companies now in Nigeria that are thriving. By dumping seeds from multinational seed companies that are giving donations through countries, you're going to destroy 15 years of seed system work. So I mean, that one is a glaring example, but it shows you how we have to unlearn knee-jerk reactions in development because they destroy our scaling efforts and they set us back. So I think it's almost like that bad news is a shocker. Guys, you think you're doing good, you're setting us back. So data. The second is really telling stories and using media to tell positive stories where impact is working, where you build community support and community ownership. Then communities demand that with government changing, the scaling doesn't stop. And we've done that very well at Leap Africa. Leap turned 20 last year. And now we're now working in 8 African countries. And it took people saying, young people saying, I want this. And funders realizing we need this. And then working with the funders to scale. in 8 African countries has been a phenomenal success story. But it really was about us being more creative about telling our stories with data and amplifying our voices so that others want to join the winning team. And I don't think enough of us do it. I used to say early in my work, let people speak about our work. I don't want to talk about it. I want to be humble. But I think we have to get off that humility bandwagon and say, we should talk about our work if it's good so that it's celebrated, but so we attract the right partners to scale as well. So those would be my 2 responses.
Thanks. Erin, go ahead.
Let's see if, I'm not sure if you can hear me.
Yeah, there
Thanks,
you are.
guys. I really appreciate having the opportunity to learn from these sessions. It's really been great, and I see some of this reflected also in the comments here. I just wanted to say something that I think ties together a few of the comments that we see in the chat about really the unlearning that Ndidi talked about, and maybe the way we need to continue to look differently at our role for those of us who work for INGOs. I know that that's not the case for everyone on this call, but thinking about our changing role when we are not the doer, when we are the facilitator, and when we are not also the source of the big idea or the innovation, and thinking about how we couch ourselves as just one of the many, many important players in these multiple systems that are going to sustain a real change at scale. So how do we play increasingly that facilitation role or convening role or technical assistance role in some cases? It really varies, but just really rethinking our role from being the initiator of the big idea to being one of the elements in the system that supports making that possible at scale.
Thanks very much. Jenny, are you on? Jenny Proman Robinson? No. While I wait for a couple of other hands to go up, let me offer just 1 or 2 of my own observations about this. I know it's not exactly polite to praise your own family members, but you couldn't help but be impressed by not only the sophistication, but the breadth of participation in the comments that people made this year. It was just a really rewarding thing to think back over the last 7 or 8 years and what it had looked like in years past compared to now. And without casting aspersions on what went before, it's just such a quantum leap in both the number of people that are involved and the sensitivity and the thoughtfulness of their comments. The other thing that really struck me in that regard is that in the early days, almost all the talk was about problems, all the challenges, all the hurdles, and those still figure prominently. But in every session, there were a series of things that were steps forward, that were significant steps forward, sometimes even solutions to problems. And that for me is vital in terms of its importance to our field and to our credibility in terms of trying to tackle some of these problems. I was struck again by the power of the cross-sectoral and cross-thematic approaches. That was the big experiment Johannes and I were testing when we started this community of practice, namely whether there was enough value to be gained by talking across what would be the normal silos to warrant people giving their time and effort to doing just that. And I think that hypothesis has been examined and there's a clear answer to it now. I mean, this was evidenced by your comments, but I think also evidenced by the impact we're having on donors and on host country governments and on a variety of implementing partners, that cross-sectoral vantage point is both taking root and having benefit. And finally, I think it's important that we are now focusing, we're not an advocacy organization, but we are advocacy on one issue, and that's the importance of taking scale seriously and systematically. And when we started 7 or 8 years ago, that focus was on helping ourselves find our voice, find whatever insights we possibly could, and encouragement from one another. But I think now increasingly, we're turning our attention outwards in terms of trying to change the discourse in funder organizations and host country governments and foundations and so on. And I wouldn't claim full credit for this, but I want to believe that we've had some significant impact on that, because it's certainly the case that this language is finding its way reliably into the things people say. To my own taste, not yet so much into the things people do. So I think the challenge that lies ahead of us, and that was pointed out by so many of you, is to continue to both find our voice and raise our voice to push the conversation ahead about what scaling means, what scaling does, and how to do it most effectively. Didn't mean to have that sound so soapboxy, but I'm really feeling quite inspired by the conversations that we've had over the last couple of weeks, and wonder if there are any other comments. I see a hand. I'm not sure whose it is. Whoever it is, go ahead.
Hi, it's Richard Cole.
Richard. Hey,
Thanks,
Richard.
Larry. Larry, I wanted to follow up on that excellent point. This summer, when I wrote the background piece for the mainstreaming work, and maybe this is the point you and Johannes can pick up in terms of the way forward for the community of practice, we did a survey of members about what their experience was with mainstreaming in their organizations. And we had hoped to get we got fantastic responses. And for those of you who are on the call who did respond, thank you so much. It was incredibly informative. And one of the things we asked people was, what organization do you work for? I'm not aware that we have a systematic assessment of who are members of the community of practice, especially now that we're in the thousands. But at least in terms of people who responded to that survey, about 5% were people with donors, funders, foundations, bilateral and multilaterals, and everybody else was an innovator, an implementing partner, or a consultant, basically who does the work of scaling or has incentives to try to get things scaled, like innovation funders. And I guess my question is, a lot of the conversation today and in the last several weeks has been geared, and Ndidi started with this in her presentation, and thank you, it was excellent, was how do we get them inside the tent to be members of this organization, to, they're certainly selected individuals, even though fairly few in number. But I had a conversation when I was doing this with somebody that one of our members referred me to at a very large foundation who works in actually agriculture and food, and completely unaware of our activities, especially a lot of the work that's been done in agriculture and food. And I found that to be true to varying degrees of most of the donors I talked to. So I really do think engaging with funders and donors and bringing them in, I think is really critical.
Thanks. And I hope we can pick that up in the discussion about the way forward. Let's see, whose hand is that? That would be Kate Fellenberg. Go ahead, Kate.
Hello, everybody. Good morning. Good to see so many familiar faces. Just to Richard's point about the donors, I think we've all had experience speaking with donors, USAID and others, where when you're having one-on-ones or small meetings with technical officers, there tends to be agreement and appreciation for scale and for the process. And yet, when you actually submit an application, the reviewing and scoring process tends to lean back to the old school. And yesterday, within my organization, we met with a few USAID mission staff and Washington staff. And even in that conversation, you could see the difference on that. So personally, for me, I think we need to engage donors not so much on appreciating scale, but putting it back into their scoring requirements, the way the RFPs are designed, that very nuts and bolts kinds of things, because I've been to many of these kinds of events and discussed things with them, and yet somehow when things get released or scored or reviewed, depending on who's reviewing them, you see that difference. You see that fallback right to the kind of same old. So somehow we need a different approach to get that down into not the mindset, but into the nuts and bolts of how they operate.
Thanks. As if on cue, Johannes's hand went up. He's the perfect person to respond on that.
Let's see. Yeah, here I am. So we'll be, of course, working very intensively, as you'll actually hear in a minute when we talk about work going forward, on a new project that we've just started, which will be looking at how we can work with donors and, by the way, increasingly also with recipients or clients of donors to make donors mainstream their scaling into their operations more effectively. So this is conceived as a multi-year project. We are starting now with the first year, a fairly detailed program, and we'll be reaching out to the membership of the community practice to help us through various ways, including surveys and so on. So stay tuned. It'll show up when we move on to our work looking forward in a minute. But I just wanted to say that. Larry, while I have the microphone, the camera, let me quickly also get back to a comment that was somebody entered early on in the chat, and this was relating to some problems we've had in this particular annual workshop with the ability of the participants to join in with chats and see the slides and so on. We'll take a hard look at this, and I apologize on behalf of all of us who organized this for any difficulties any of you have had. It looks like today we're in better shape, so I think we may have already learned something during this set of sessions. But my apologies and my promise that we'll improve. If there are any other suggestions, by the way, looking forward, we would also welcome any hearing from you individually going ahead. One last comment in terms of the nature of this the workshop. We did explore early on to have interpretation into and from Spanish and French. Unfortunately, that turned out to be prohibitively expensive for at least for this round. We will explore this further because we do want to bring in other languages that are, or I think participants and stakeholders whose first language is or is not functioning in English. So that's an intention we have. Unfortunately, we weren't able this time. We had hoped to explore the possibility of having instantaneous AI-based instantaneous translation, which you can actually explore yourself if you want to. But we haven't gotten very far on this yet, and so looking ahead, we'll have to do more exploration on this. Hopefully, in the next workshop, we'll have some interpretation that those of you who would prefer French or Spanish could sign into. Thank you.
Johannes, don't go off camera. I think actually the timing is just about right to transition from part one to part two. So let me just say one more word by way of putting a bow on this part of the conversation, which is that this wasn't just a kind of a workshop-y technique to ask you these questions. This is a membership organization, and we really want to make sure that we're focusing on the stuff you think is most important. So if you care enough to do so, we really encourage you to send us private emails or anything else you want to do with ideas of things you think the community can do or that you personally have energy for being part of, and we'll try our best to bend in that direction. It's exactly with that tone we'd like to turn now to the second part of the conversation, which is to give you a kind of an inward-looking view of the community of practice, where we think we've come, where we think we are, and the strategic plan we have for going forward. We'll then invite your comments on that and try and figure out where we go from here. Johannes?
Great. Thanks, Larry. But before I turn to the next section, let's maybe all give a huge hand to Ndidi, because Ndidi, you just were outstanding in the way you pulled it all together for us today. So thank you so much. And of course, we'll do a summary of this. We'll share your slides, and your wonderful words will live on and will help us as we go forward. So thank you very much. And by the way, as your last slide with the way your last but one slide with your indications of what you thought were priorities for the way forward, I think will be very much accompanying us going ahead. So thank you again. Now let's turn to the second half of the session, and let's explore the community of practice strategy for 2023 to 2025. You should have all received an electronic link to the strategy document in the program or in the invitation, but we'll also put it into the chat box now. And so if you haven't had a chance to look at it, please do look at it. I think it's a good document that was actually prepared for us in large measure and for the executive committee of the community of practice by a wonderful consultant, Larry. Can you help me and recall the name of our consultant? I have a
Her name's
mental.
Parnica.
Parnica, yeah, okay. Parnica, do you remember her last name? Sorry, Parnica, if you're online, I apologize. We should bring you in later if you're with us to actually thank you in person. But anyway, so we had this prepared with the help of an excellent consultant. It was reviewed and approved by the executive committee of the community of practice last year. But I think Larry and I think the committee as a whole also believe that it's actually a living document and an approach that will be adopted as we go ahead. So your reaction today is a very good start to actually help us make this strategy into a living approach, a living document. So please share with us any reactions you have during the chat, in the chat during our presentation that we now move into, and of course in the discussion session and subsequently. Now I think it's important, Larry, and you can add to this later on also. I think Larry and I both feel that after 7+ years in existence with this community practice, we think we're at an important inflection point. And you know what we're facing here is a scaling journey, because what we're trying to do is to scale up the understanding, the attention, and the action for scaling of development impact. So we're really scaling up. And so we're kind of at a transition maybe from sort of, you know, the early stages of the scaling journey to a middle stage. And we believe as a result of this transition, we need to actually change a few things as we go ahead. Now, before we go into this journey and discuss with you details of our strategy, let me maybe just say one brief word about what we mean by scaling. And this was actually recommended to me yesterday in an email by Ruth Simmons, who remains our senior scaling guru. Hi, Ruth. Thank you for joining us again today. But it's also mentioned today by Ndidi. And this is that we really should discuss, sort of as we start with any conversation about scaling, we should actually just take a minute and make sure we all agree on what we mean by it. So for today's discussion, let me just suggest that we use the definition that is actually in the community practice document on scaling principles and lessons. And the definition is that scaling is a systematic process leading to a sustainable, and I would add equitable impact, affecting a large and increasing proportion of the relevant need. Now, this particular definition can be adapted to particular context, indeed needs to be adapted to particular context. And my main suggestion, just a takeaway actually from our experience and also today's discussion with Ndidi, is that it really is important to be clear what definition we use and to share it and validate it with the teams that we work with our partners, clients, and audience. So just sort of by way of introduction to our topic, I thought we'd say a brief word. I'd say a brief word about what we mean by scaling. But with that, let's move into the discussion of our strategy. And if we could put up the slides, that would be great. Thank you very much. There they are. And we can actually move straight on to the next slide, please. So it's the title says of this title slide, past and future. So let's start with a few words about the origins and the past, looking back, just to know where we're coming from, because in a scaling pathway, it's always important to build on the past. So just to remind you, for those of you who are new to community practice, we started back in February 2015 with a first meeting of about 40 participants, an in-person meeting at MSI offices, where we decided and agreed to establish a community practice, to organize annual workshops, to have regular newsletters. By the way, today we're just about starting to prepare the 26th newsletter. And we started forming 4 working groups: education, agricultural development, monitoring, evaluation, and fragile states. Working groups would be meeting at intermittent webinars and, of course, during annual workshops. Now, the purpose of the community practice was to connect, inform, empower, and promote scaling of development impact with a cross-sectoral, cross-topic, and global perspective. The membership was to be open to all, voluntary and no cost to the members, but the expectation was that all of us would share experience and knowledge for mutual benefit. Now, administratively, we built on our on Larry's affiliation with MSI, Management Systems International, in Washington and Arlington, Virginia, I guess, to help us administer this, and eventually, when we started raising money, also act as our fiscal agent. Next slide, please. So since 2015, we grew in numbers of members from the initial roughly 40 to about 2,500, affiliated with some 400 plus organizations in what we think is about 30 countries. We now have 9 working groups. We've added health, nutrition, youth employment, social enterprise, and climate change. We've had 7 annual workshops. The last 3 were virtual, and in each one we had about 7, 11, or sometimes 12 sessions with close to 1,000 participants in each workshop. We have a website, and this was set up with space for the community practice as a whole, but also for the working groups to share information. And we've been, although not very much so, but we've started being active on Twitter and LinkedIn and social media more generally. We have started, the last 3 years, we started raising financial resources to help us with administration expenses, knowledge products, and so on. We raised a total of just over 400,000 in cash and 125,000 in kind for those 3 years. Based on these financial resources, we were able to also start producing some knowledge products, and I'm just listing here the 5 that particularly stand out. We had a paper on new scaling consensus and issues. We had a paper, an issues paper on scaling and systems change. We had a paper on institutionalizing scaling in governance. We had a background paper on mainstreaming scaling in funder organizations, and we had a paper that reflected actually consensus of the community practice on scaling principles and lessons. Let me give a shout out here to Richard Cole, who spoke earlier today. Without Richard, who did much of the legwork and intellectual work in putting together many of these documents, it would not have been possible to be where we are today with the knowledge products that we have produced. So Richard, thank you very much. You've been a pillar of knowledge work for the community practice. Now, we always ask ourselves, what is our impact? Larry already gave you a little sense of our humility in this. We believe we've had some impact collectively as a community practice, but of course it's difficult to measure. And in any case, you know, I think what we can say is we've been riding a wave here, because since we started with perhaps a ripple of interest in scaling 10, 15 years ago, I think today, at least from my perspective and what we see, of course, with the community practice itself, I think there really is a big wave now. And I think we're riding this wave. And to some extent, hopefully, we can also make sure this wave actually results in effective impact and results for the people out there that we really care about, and for the globe that we, as we heard earlier today, also we need to act urgently. Now, next slide, please. So as we turn to the new strategy, what are the key elements? Well, we decided it was time to have a theory of change for the community practice and to link our vision. As good scalers, we know, of course, we need to have a vision, to link that through our goals, through outcomes, with the actual activities that we are promoting under the community of change. Now, in terms of the vision, the impact that we want to achieve, we've identified the sustained development impact at national and global scale, with goals being that we could achieve a quantum leap in the professionals that have scaling knowledge, in organizations that are focused on and have a mindset and the capacity to scale, and the quantum leap finally in terms of funders, a topic we discussed, of course, earlier already, who are systematically supporting scaling. To achieve those goals and the ultimate impact, we promote certain activities and with them outcomes, namely to connect development professionals, to develop and disseminate knowledge, to promote effective and systematic action on all of this on scaling, and will make a special effort to involve actors, increasingly actors from the Global South. Next slide, please. So next slide, please. Gabi. Okay, next slide. There we go. No, not yet. So how will we get there? What are our activities specifically? So we will continue with the working groups. Some of them need to be rejuvenated, and we may also want to add a limited number of new ones, but only where there's a strong case and where we have a clear leadership willing to take these potential new working groups forward. We will continue with the annual workshops, but we will, based on our experience, try to enhance quality, but also make sure we have greater impact and outreach as a result of them by more systematic follow-up, and some of this is already happening this year. We will continue with the newsletter, but I think there's time maybe to take a new approach, be more agile, maybe more shorter and pithier, so it takes less time to wade through a lot of pages on your computer. We want to intensify our knowledge work. I already mentioned the new project that we started in 2023 on mainstreaming, scaling, and funder organizations, but there are other initiatives we want to explore, including the work, continuing the work on institutionalizing scaling in government and other local organizations. The whole question of digital scaling, which we discussed in our second plenary at the beginning of the workshop, monitoring evaluation for scaling, and finally, the question, how do we best link scaling and the SDGs, the implementation of SDGs and the Paris Agreement targets. We need to move also to intensify communication promotion with updating the website, intensifying our social media outreach, and engage with thought leaders in the development space. And finally, as I already mentioned, we really want to expand our footprint, if that's the right way to put it, in the Global South by expanding membership, active engagement from members of the Global South, including as working group chairs and as participants in knowledge product production, as well as in the governance more generally of the workshop, of the community of practice. With that, I think I'll hand over to Larry, if we could move to the next slide. Larry, over to you.
Well, proving that Johannes and I really are Tweedledum and Tweedledee, I'll be Tweedledum and pick up right where he left off. And just by saying that we think if we're going to move ahead as a community, it's important to know how well we're doing and to hold ourselves accountable to ourselves. One of the nice things about a community of practice is that truthfully, we're not accountable to anyone but ourselves, but that means there's a premium on being genuinely accountable to ourselves. So how are we going to know whether we're making progress on this? Well, first of all, obviously, we're trying to produce and disseminate information. We think we can and should be judged in part by the quality of what comes out of that. That includes, and we hope results in, building some sort of a coherent narrative around scaling, where different actors in different sectors can speak about this in a consistent way, in a way that allows us, when we're advocating, to know we're advocating for the same thing. And when we're learning, know that we're really learning lessons that are comparable. I think we've made tremendous progress over 7 years on that, but as several of you have pointed out, that work's not finished. Maybe most important and most intangible are trying to shift mindsets about the application of scaling among governments and donors. And if I were going to signal one thing that both Johannes and I feel strongly about in terms of changing the nature of the community of practice, we think we ought to take a more forceful, forward-leaning approach vis-a-vis funders and other decision makers in terms of trying to promote not just as a concept, but a set of principles, a set of tools, a set of approaches, and a set of institutional practices that really embody scaling. It's okay to talk the talk, but it would be a whole lot better if people were walking the walk, and we see ourselves as a community as having some moral stature and maybe some credibility in trying to push those issues. As Johannes mentioned, again, we're pleased with the progress in terms of Southern voices in the deliberations of the community of practice. We'd like to move even further in terms of Southern leadership within the community of practice. And we've got some first steps in that direction. We're certainly open to suggestion about how to go further. As he mentioned as well, our current membership is about 2,500. We've set for ourselves the goal of doubling that over the next couple of years, and I have every reason to think we'll do that. Now, some of these things are more easily quantified than others, but since we do consider ourselves first, foremost, and maybe exclusively a membership organization, the most important way to know is to hear what you all think from your own vantage points about these various issues. We'll survey that more consistently than we have in the past, but we're also welcoming at any point in time any input any of you would like to provide. Next slide. So some of these things have implications for how we're structured as an organization. I want to just share a couple of them with you. One of the things that personally I think has really served us well is that we've been a volunteer-based organization and a lot of people have leaned in. If we move toward a certain amount more formality, it's important that we do that in a way that does not sacrifice what I think has been best about exactly who we are. So our tightrope that we're trying to walk is how to add more structure, more continuity, maybe a little bit more girth to what we're doing without undermining the things that we hold most dear about the community. So one issue we think has to do with the way the financial management is done. As Johannes mentioned, we've done this for the last 7 years, sort of under the wing of MSI, the organization I used to lead. And MSI would happily have us stay there for a while, but I think that's probably not a good long-term solution for the community of practice. So we originally thought we would spin it out as an independent 501c3. The more we looked at that, the more we thought that was going to be more trouble than it was worth. And the idea we're exploring right now is what's called fiscal sponsorship, where the actual legal entity goes through an organized organization that can accept funds, but that the community of practice continues to function for every practical purpose as if it were an independent and separate organization. For that, we pay a fee to the fiscal sponsor, but we also offload a fair amount of responsibility. Second thing we'd like to do, and this is dependent on being able to raise resources we have not yet raised, is to try to incorporate a small core staff. Johannes and I have been serving as co-chairs for a long time. Neither one of us are running for the door, but that we think is a source of vulnerability to the organization, and it would be stronger and maybe could do a lot more if we had at least somebody who was in a paid position to help with this. So our first step on that, if we can raise the resources, is to have a part-time executive director and a part-time program manager, eventually we hope growing to a full-time version of each. The working groups, we imagine, will continue to function as before, which means the individual co-chairs exercise considerable influence over what is done and how it's done. But the rest of you who are members, we're hoping will either raise your hands to be co-chairs or will again work with those co-chairs to shape the activities. Membership, we're determined, will remain open and free, but we did institute something a couple of years ago called sustaining members. And those are organizations. Remember, our members are individuals, but the sustaining members are organizations which are able and willing to contribute a minimum of $30,000 over 2 years, so 15 and 15, over a 2-year period, either in cash or in kind, for the administrative support of the community of practice. Again, that's not paying co-chairs, it's not paying leadership, but it is important for things like bringing people to meetings, supporting events such as these, and producing the knowledge products that Johannes was describing. We currently have 11 of those sustaining members. We would wish for more. We also invented a concept, thanks to ExpandNet, who were our inaugural example of this, of what we're now calling contributing members, which is any one of you whose organizations or just as an individual is able to contribute anything in cash or in kind. The more people feel themselves invested in this, we think the stronger we'll be. Next slide. Also has implications for the governance. The current arrangement and the way we imagine it will continue is that there's a governing council or an executive, we've called it an executive committee, but we're going to transition that notion to calling it a governing council that will include the working group chairs, representatives from the sustaining members, for the moment, Johannes and myself, all of whom serve pro bono. That governing council will appoint and supervise the executive director, the working group chairs, will set strategy, financial oversight, and so on. We imagine, as in the past, it'll meet at least 2 or 3 times a year, virtually and in person. And new feature, we'll have some committees: governance and administration, budget and finance, strategy, bylaws, and with the executive directors as secretary to that group. Because that group becomes quite large now, it's up around 30, we think it's important to institute something we're calling here an executive committee, which would be made up of the heads of the 3 standing committees and the leaders, the co-leaders for the moment, Johannes and myself, which would oversee the executive director, do the day-to-day operations, and maintain contact with all of you and with the governing council. Next slide. What does all that cost? Well, we've costed it out. We think for the next couple of years, this year and next, it's about $350,000 a year. And if we really transition to full-time staff in 2025, that would be $500,000 that year. That's not just for staffing, that's also the knowledge work, that the part of that requires financial support. To get there, we'd like to grow our 11 sustaining members to 20. Your help and your advice on that would be much appreciated. We're going to reach out to everyone else and encourage people to be, if they can be, contributing members at whatever level is possible for you. We're hoping for 2 institutional support grants of $200,000, $100,000 per year for 2 years. We have one tentatively identified, but that one grantor would very much like to be matched by another. And so we're desperately in search of a second grantor. And frankly, finding that money is the margin of difference between being able to afford and not being able to afford the staff that we're hoping to add. There may be, and there probably will be, restricted grants to the community of practice to do particular pieces of work. And we've received, and we hope we'll get more, in-kind contributions from some of your organizations that can simply do some of the things that the community of practice hopes to do. There's no reason for the money to come into us if it can simply stay in your coffers and be put toward the sort of functions that we care about. Last slide. So that means there are several next steps, and I'm going to transition in a second to your thoughts on these. First of all, as Johannes mentioned, we'll put the video slides and summaries on the website and push them out. We're also going to do a proceedings paper based on all of the summaries of the sessions and make that available to all of you and anyone else who might be interested, and try to capture some high points in the newsletter. If any of you have ideas for additional dissemination mechanisms or things you would like us to do in that regard, we're definitely game for doing that. We're going to take any feedback we get today and relook at the strategy document and see if it needs a tweak or two. As I said, we're desperately looking for a second institutional funder, and any other sources of sustaining and contributing members. Advice highly welcomed, even solicited. We're going to set up the governance structure as mentioned. We're going to identify and hire an executive director and project manager part-time when and if we can get the resources to do that. We will, in any event, produce some bylaws, work toward a fiscal agent, continue to expand the knowledge program, reassess the strategy, and keep you all posted. Let me pause there. That was a lot of stuff. I'm sorry for the long monologue, but we really would like to have any input you can share with us now. And the session will this is the session that will be open indefinitely. So anything you don't have a chance to say today, we're anxious to hear at any time.
Larry, maybe I can quickly come in. I've been
Please,
watching.
yeah, Gabby, let's take down the slides and just put Johannes and myself up if you wouldn't mind.
I've been watching as best I could the chat box, and I maybe two responses already to comments that I found there. One, Margaret related to, talked about the need for building capacity that donors need to focus on perhaps more, and I couldn't agree more. That's a very important part of what donors should be doing. And by the way, I think it's worth pointing out this links directly up with the localization focus, which is now, at least in USAID and in this country, the US, a major issue of debate and how best to move towards localization of the way donors function in terms of their work, rather than keeping basically much of the work back at home. So yeah, I couldn't agree more. The second point, Nigel, you made a comment on language other than English. Yes, I agree with you, and it isn't explicitly, actually, it should have been, you're right, in the strategy document. So yes, we will focus on that. I think it's a challenge. I mean, it's tough. As I said, we tried already this time. In part, it's just a matter of money, but it's also a question of how best to actually then organize it, with whom, and so on. So it'll take some thinking, it'll take some resources, but it's clearly something which we'd like to do. Since we know that there are a lot of our audience, a lot of our potential members, a lot of the people that really ought to engage and lead ultimately this community practice out there and don't necessarily speak English. So probably other comments.
Yeah, I want to pick up on another one which raises the possibility or asks the question about affiliating with other communities of practice. And I give you the good example of our health working group, which was very much enriched by folding in a prior group that Laura had an active role in forming, that had a mandate and composition very comparable to our own. We were enriched literally by bringing in 500 members that had been part of that became part of this community of practice as a result. That was a great step forward as far as I'm concerned, and I would love to see that happen again. Probably, I'm speculating, under the auspices of one or the other of the working groups, since they tend to be either sectoral or thematic, those outside groups. So any of you who are members of such groups that you think it would be useful to approach about folding into this community of practice, that's absolutely consistent with both the spirit and the strategy that we have in mind.
Yeah, maybe I was just looking at Benoit's, I think if I pronounce your name correctly, Benoit from GIZ, is it? You made a comment that is maybe maybe a word of caution about what we should expect from our work with donors and mainstreaming, scaling donors. I mean, I agree with you. Look, I've been in a way, I've been working over the last 15 years with multiple donors, by the way, including GIZ for the last off and on, and more off than on, I have to admit, for the last 15 years. And but also intensively for 6 years, intensively with IFAD, for example, in Rome, quite intensive for a couple of years with the UNDP. And you know, it is tough going to get the scaling agenda to stick inside well-established, traditionally managed, project-oriented organizations. Is an uphill battle. But I'm not giving up, and I see this project that we now are working on as an opportunity to actually hopefully make a bit of a lasting difference, more so than I've been able alone in the recent past. So your help, everybody's help in this community will be much appreciated. And we will reach out proactively to all of you through surveys and inviting you to join in whatever way you wish, including, by the way, with webinars that we'll be organizing. So yes, this is going to be a real challenge, but I think it's also an opportunity. So thanks, Benoit, for your comment, and please stay engaged from GIZ, because GIZ is actually one of our key partners in this new project. So welcome to the party.
I see a comment, Johannes, from Chip Walker about the feasibility of our having a membership directory, something we've not talked about before, but I actually think that's a good idea.
I think it's a great idea. I mean, look, let's be clear. Once we have the resources that we're trying to mobilize, say the 350, whatever the goal is, you know, we can do a lot of things which, as a purely volunteer organization so far, with a bit of money to sort of support basic operations, but we couldn't do. So yes, I think a more systematic accounting for our membership, a more systematic, tracking of who actually we are, and sharing that to the extent members want to share their information, I think is a terrific idea.
Yeah, you know, one other, this is not a substitute, Chip, for your suggestion, which I think is a good one. But I've noticed that on the COP's webpage, there are also subpages for each of the working groups. And a lot of you are members, but you're not listed there just because you never bothered to put yourself there. I think if those who are so inclined would more actively just log on to that, then we would at least know of each other, and you'd be able to connect to one another without going through any kind of a hub. There was I saw another suggestion, which was about developing a curriculum, and we've talked various times about trying to pull together some of the tools. We have some of those featured on the website. We have talked at various times about doing a more comprehensive either packaging or assembly of those. That's, I would say, is prominent on the to-do list when we can find time and resources to do that.
Well, maybe just to mention that one of our members, actually the co-chair of our social enterprise group, Isabel Guerrero, of course, has been teaching a course at Harvard Kennedy School for a few years now. So that is a resource which we could draw on. I think it's also, and I don't know whether Laura is still with us. Laura, if you want to talk for a minute about what ExpandNet is now doing with financing, I believe, from the Gates Foundation in terms of developing a training, correct me if I'm wrong, but a training course initially focused on your area. Yeah, I think I see Laura. Yeah, Laura's hand up. Laura, say a word. So, Ruth, you raised this question. Yeah, this is a frontier which we'll be continuing to also push at. And again, it's in part resource constrained, but it's in part also where our membership can be very helpful, because if you, the members who work at universities or think tanks or teaching knowledge-related organizations, if you can push in your own context, we'd be happy to help, but take a lead, run with it. So Laura, maybe your turn.
Laura and then Hisham.
Great, thanks everybody. Yes, indeed, ExpandNet is entering a new phase of work where we're trying to develop what's called a scale-up learning center, which will be an online open source learning opportunity for anyone and everyone who wants to take advantage of learning about what we know about scaling up from the perspective of many of the leaders you've met this last couple of weeks. We hope to have some of you give lectures there, etc., so that there is a place, one place, and that a subset of people can apply to go through a certificate program so they can show that they've completed the entire curriculum. And then there'll even be a smaller subset of people who can become scaling up mentors. So yes, thank you for giving a hat tip to this work, and keep your eyes in this space over the next 6 months. We hope to launch it for public consumption. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Hisham? You're still on mute, Hisham. No. Can you get off mute?
Maybe while we try and get Hisham on, let me comment on a couple of other comments in the chat. One asked about regional and national chapters. Yeah, I mean, again, it's a matter of if somebody would like to take a lead in this by, for example, organizing a national chapter, or if somebody has a regional perspective in one of the regional development banks or on whatever platform, we'd be very happy to engage on that and explore how we can do that, in what ways linked to the community practice, supporting you. But the lead will have to come from one or more of you. So please, if that's an idea you'd like to pursue, let us know, and we'd be very happy to talk about it. Then I think Nigel was also commenting on, let's move to, if we can somehow move to what I call from zero-sum thinking to positive-sum thinking. I couldn't agree with you more. I think the challenge and the opportunity of scaling is precisely that scaling involves positive-sum thinking. And, unfortunately, in the politics of today, certainly in this country, but elsewhere also, increasingly we seem to be stuck in negative-sum thinking or zero-sum thinking. So let's try and move the needle on this collectively as a group. And again, delighted to be part of it. Thank you. Maybe Hisham, your turn.
Thank you so much. I'm sorry, Larry, the mic was not clear. Do you hear me now?
Yes.
Thank you so much. The question for both of you and everybody is the issue of, is there any strategy to have more global South participation? For example, having a focal point of contact in certain region as a member from our like corporate members to be mobilizer, if you will. And point of contact. The other question I have, the word partnership in all the session came again and again and again. So the question is is there any interest to have a thematic approach for working group, for example, for example, one on IT for a certain period of time, like 23, or one on partnership, and what does it mean to really have effective partnership within scaling up? So these are the two questions: how to engage more global South. Second, the thematic approach for work group. Thank you.
I'll respond, and then Johannes, maybe you'll also respond. So on the issue of global South, I'm gratified on one front and still ambitious on another front. We're now up to 60 countries that we have members from, and I haven't done a count recently, but I think if I did do a count, about maybe somewhere getting toward half are either in the global South or from the global South, or somehow you could legitimately claim our Southern voices in this. So on that score, we're way, way, way better than we were a couple of years ago. In terms of the actual leadership of working groups, that has not been manifested yet. And so we're on a program right now to make sure that each one of the working groups has at least a co-chair that's from the global South. That was more challenging before than it is now, because we had so many fewer members from the global South. Now we've got quite a lot. And so I'm optimistic that when we have this conversation next year, the leadership team will be much more clearly evident of that effort. On the issue, and I forgot what Hisham's second point was now. I thought I had it.
Hisham, can you come back on the second point?
Come back and remind me your second point, Hisham. Oh yeah, thematic working group. Thank you, Laura. So this is, I don't know how to say this any more emphatically than Johannes and I are trying to say it. This is a real community of practice. It's an underlying community on that. There is no executive leadership team, really. There's no paid staff, really. So we're only as good as the membership, and we're only responsible to the membership. So we'll follow any lead that people have enthusiasm for, so long as it's promoting scaling. That means any thematic issue that we could assemble a group on, we're happy to do it. Any regional affiliation, we'd be delighted. But there's nobody to do it but us meaning the collective us on this. So anybody who's got a great idea, assume the answer from our point of view is absolutely yes, if we can muster the enthusiasm and the energy needed to do it.
Thanks, Larry. I want to pick up a couple of comments in the, actually 3 comments in the chat, and then probably we need to move to closing fairly soon to keep everybody to their timelines. So first of all, Richard Cole, you reminded us that it was Purnima Chawla of the Center for Nonprofit Strategies who helped us tremendously with developing the strategy. And I apologize to Purnima in her absence, unless she's with us now, but for not remembering the name. It's terrible. Anyway, so Purnima did a great job. And as Richard mentions, it's actually the Center for Nonprofit Strategies is very helpful. So if you need help, go to that center and to Purnima. I can highly recommend it. Then there is Saradan Musa, who commented on the importance of engaging with governments and making sure that we create a mindset of scaling within governments. I agree with you. And actually, we've started tackling this topic with work that particularly Larry was leading together with his co-chairs in the monitoring evaluation group on institutionalizing scaling in governments. And that you will actually, if you haven't already seen it, there's a paper that they, together with another consultant, prepared on precisely the question of institutionalization of innovative initiatives in governments. And one option for future work is actually pursue this. I think this goes also beyond just governments, by the way. It goes into the whole question of that our social enterprise working group is pursuing. How do you help social enterprises scaling up? And there, the Imago, the NGO being led by Isabel Guerrero, is of course a key player. And even in the private sector, I mean, in the private sector too, we need to help, I think, installing mindsets and supporting, in one way or another, supporting scaling efforts. So thank you for your comment. It's a very important part of the equation. Finally, I see that Jenny Perman, you made a bunch of points which I couldn't quickly read. But Larry, if you don't mind, should we ask Jenny, perhaps by way of rounding out the session, to actually make her points?
That'd be great. In fact, I called you out, Jenny, before, but I think you're busy with a workman. If you're available now, come on for a minute.
Sure. Sorry. Is my mic working?
Yes.
You can hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay. Yeah, I apologize. I was in and out at the beginning. I was just struck by, I think, the comments I wanted to share on Ndidi's excellent presentation actually directly align, I think, to so much of what you all identified and outlined for some of our next steps. And, I don't think I'm, sharing anything new, but for me, I guess just reflecting on the past 2 weeks and the tremendous sessions I was part of, it seems like there's been this journey, both within the COP itself and sort of the larger scaling field, if you will, of really identifying the need and providing conceptual clarity by what we mean about scaling, definitions around scaling, systems change, system transformation, and the relationship between them. Here I'm thinking about Richard Cole and colleagues' excellent contributions, and then all the work of the members between providing very clear terminology, definitions, some case examples, and then really practical frameworks. So I think that's just been a tremendous value add of this group and real clear need. And I think there's been just tremendous movement there. And then sort of really building on Ndidi's point about identifying the success factors or key principles behind scaling, the sort of what, if you will, around scaling, and not just scaling, but really thinking about what does it mean to do scaling in a cost-effective, sustainable, and equitable way, and certainly a lot more to learn there. And then this notion of catalyzing mindset shifts, and among these different stakeholders that we've been talking about, among implementers, among policymakers, among funders, and really thinking about, what does it mean to have this mindset shift around these key scaling principles or success factors. And then I think where I sort of see the field and the COP going, and what I also just heard in the second part that Johannes and Larry led, was really moving from the what to the how, right? So how do we actually apply these principles among these not only individuals, but across institutions, and really thinking about what does it look like, within particular context among specific groups of individuals. So again, I don't mean to imply a linear progression or that sort of we can check boxes and the job has been done, but I was just reflecting on this journey and sort of the iterative nature as well of it, and just excited for sort of what you've laid out. My very last comment just on the sort of practical part of some of these next steps is I think the scaling field itself has also evolved and shifted tremendously, right, since 2015. When you all launched this community of practice, I would argue there was much less happening around this in many ways as sort of a learning community of practice. And so one interesting exercise might be at some point in the next phase is to just do sort of a stock taking of what are these different sort of learning communities of practices, and how can we make sure this COP is best building on and linking to what is happening, because I just think that sort of field itself, certainly as sort of communities of practices and learning networks, has also grown, I would argue, in large part thanks to both of you and this community. So thank you both.
Thank you. Very reluctantly, I'm going to bring this conversation to a close. It was as heartwarming as I hoped it would be to watch what's happened over the last 7 years, and also to have such enthusiastic fellow travelers as all of you. So I want to thank again Gabby, Natalie, Adam, and Sam. As always, thanks to you, Johannes, for being such a wonderful partner in all of this. And thanks to all of you for getting us where we are and for staying with us as we get where we need to go. Johannes.
Thank you, Larry, and thanks to everybody. Once again, I want to thank our support team who've been just wonderful. So Natalie, Gabi, Sam, and Adam, much appreciated. You've been just, without you, we couldn't have done this. And thank you to all of you who came today, because, you know, without you, this community wouldn't be what it is. So keep engaged, respond to our surveys when you see them, contribute to the newsletter. You should have received just an invitation to actually contribute to the next newsletter, and just keep with us and make it work. Thank you so much, and all the best.